much, Anne. Thank you all for being here. It's such an honor and a privilege to speak to you. As Anne said, I work for the International Secretariat of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And we're privileged to have women in 33 countries to keep our movement going. We think of ourselves far more than being an organization with a movement. We're the oldest women peace movement in the world, and we have volunteers, thousands of volunteers around the world who believe in the vision, in the feminist, anti-militarist vision that we have and would like to take it forward. And I know that the theme of the festival this year is about migration. By no means I'm a specialist in migration, but I'd like to speak to you about how we at WILF tackle migration from the roots. How do we want migration not to be the only fleeing and displacement, not to be the only option for people in conflict countries. So Anne generously offered me to do a presentation, but I thought we'd love this to be a discussion. We have so much to learn and so much to know from your views about what we do. So please jump in at any minute, ask questions, tell me your thoughts. This is more of an open discussion for all of us, hopefully to know a little bit more about what we at WILF do, but also how you look at it and how you think of it. So for those of you who are not WILF members yet, I'm going to tell you a little bit about our history and how we came here. And I'm really, we have Helen, who's our historian and who has been keeping our history going, and please pick one of our leaflets which says a lot about the development of WILF. I'm going to take you through it very, very briefly, but if you have any questions, we're very privileged to have Helen here with us. The movement started in 1915 when 1,300 women came from all around the world to The Hague to try and stop World War I. You can imagine how hard it was back then to go from one country to another, from one continent to another, and for women at that time, most of them didn't have the right to vote. Most of them come from the suffragette movement, and they went and tried to take proactive action against war. The war still happened, but these women brought their ideas together and started the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And it's a feminist, anti-militarist vision that is saying we cannot wait for wars to happen to stop them and to find solutions for all the problems they make. What we need is to tackle the root causes of war and to stop these before many, many people die. Now, 101 years later now, and 2 world wars, many, many agonies, we believe that the vision of WILF has never been needed so much. Everything that those progressive, extremely insightful women realized 101 years ago stands exactly the same now, only weapons are more developed, their killing abilities are far higher, their impact on civilians are insurmountable. Back then, in early 1900s, 1 civilian would die for every 9 combatants. Today, 11 civilians die for every 1 combatant. So the war just came to where we live, to schools, to hospitals, to our houses, and we cannot afford not to take action against it. It's not only those who choose to take part. So we believe that it's our duty to first assess how this war is impacting people differently. We know it's impacting civilians differently by numbers. But how do we know how it's impacting women differently? We take it upon ourselves, we in many organizations, feminist organizations around the world, to assess this impact and to see what can be done about it from the roots, not after these hostilities happen. Today, WILF is, as I said, what started as a group of women in The Hague. Today we're in 33 countries. Every single one of them is volunteers. There's a very, very few staff in Geneva and New York, where our international secretariat and our second office, and they're in these two cities because we hope to impact and influence decision makers in these two capitals. In Geneva, as you know, there's the Human Rights Council and most treaty bodies, and in New York there's the Security Council and the rest of treaty bodies. And at 12 we have 4 programs, and what we do is we have a Reaching Critical Will program, which is our disarmament program. We try to monitor the use of arms per country, but also per arm. So we monitor how the arms are developing and how are they being used, who are they impacting, and what can be done about them. We also do a lot of research on arms and how they impact different groups differently. And I'm going to give you a few examples of some of our findings. So, for example, recently there's, and I know you can see here about a protest on the use of the attacks in Syria. I'm Syrian, and in Syria and in a few countries, there's this trend of the use of explosive weapons in highly populated areas. They no longer bomb, they use bombs and barrel bombs and other very explosive weapons, and they use them in populated areas under all sorts of excuses. So we at WILF went and researched how do these have a gendered impact. Who is at home when men are fighting? Who is in markets and in schools and around very highly populated areas? And if they're not the actual targets of these weapons, how do they impact them in a different way? And the findings were quite horrifying. One of the findings, for example, is that women might not be the highest number of victims of such arms, but 80% of death during pregnancy and delivery could have been prevented if women could make it to healthcare centers. These numbers you wouldn't get at the victims count. They don't tell you that. They tell you 5,000 men died, 1,000 women died, but they don't tell you that many, many thousands of women are dying because they cannot reach healthcare and they need it differently. They won't tell you that, for example, in besieged areas, women are the last to eat, they eat least, they make all the food, they look for food, and so on. So this sort of gendered impact is almost always overlooked. And we try to look at it just to say we have everything to gain from the control of arms. We also lobby against the development of new arms. One of our biggest campaigns is the campaign against nuclear weapons, and we are achieving great successes very recently. Now the resolutions on nuclear weapons are being discussed in Geneva, and we had an influence on that. We also are trying to stop the efforts to develop what we call killer robots, which are self-directed weapons where there is no human involved at any point of the use of these arms, and in the campaigns against drones and the use of drones and so on. So that's what we try to do on the armament part. We also work on human rights. We lobby for a gendered, anti-militarist vision of the development of laws, but also of decisions made in treaty bodies and elsewhere. And I'm going to give you some examples from our work in crisis response. We also have a department that works on women, peace and security, the 1325 resolution of the UN Security Council, which says that women lay at the heart of peace building and peacekeeping. And we cannot overlook the role of women in shaping the peace building process, both their efforts but also the way they're impacted by it. It's a very important resolution, and the feminist movement and women organizations around the world have been trying to build on it. It's 16-year-old now. It's nowhere near where we would like it to be in implementation. And then there's the fourth program, which I work in, called the crisis response, and it's the newest. The organization is 101-year-old, and our program is only 4 years old. And it developed organically after the Arab Spring and also other very recent conflicts, where we realized that part of what we do very well at WILF is feminist movement building. We support women groups that in conflict areas and in other countries to actually be able to organize, coordinate, make a difference nationally on the local level. So the program started as a small MENA project, Middle East and North Africa, where we started making mapping and analyzing and partnering with organizations in the Middle East and North Africa who are trying to do exactly what we do, analyze the impact on women and also work together to have bigger role in peacekeeping and peace building. Now we have a project in Bosnia where we work with women who reorganized after 20 years of the Dayton Agreement to see what went right and what went wrong and transfer these experiences to women in other contexts. We have a program in Ukraine where we are very proud that we managed to go to Ukraine and analyze and work with women organizations quite early on in when the conflict seemed to be starting. And now we're studying a program in Colombia. We have a section in Colombia who's done great work over the past 4 years on the peace agreement. And we're trying to support them through our crisis response department. So in the crisis response department, everything that I've just mentioned about our work in disarmament and in peace building has been really, it's amazing to see how it happens locally. And how is this related to migration and is quite organic, but also I found it very fascinating. What Western Europe is trying to look at backwards, in our opinion, they're trying to deal with the consequences, is what we found women to be dealing with quite early on, when they are root causes. They're trying to deal with the massive armament movement. They're trying to deal with the use of explosive weapons. They're trying to deal with the many people who are young men mainly, who are forced into no option but being fighters. They're trying to create other options for them. They're trying to influence their own children and children who they have access to as mothers and sisters and as really change makers in the society to see first inform them that they have other options, but also to use their energy and power towards something good, to break what we call is breaking the cycle of violence. And this is not only the visible violence, they also break the cycle of war economy. In countries like Yemen, for example, or Libya or Syria, where suddenly the entire economy is either based on arming or based on aid. Both of them are a part of the cycle of war economy. And women try to break this cycle. They try to make people's income and people's livelihood separate from that of war, so they can make choices whether they want to be involved or not. Now, unfortunately, in countries where there's huge use of explosive weapons mainly, where the lives of civilians is never spared, we face high displacement rate. People flee in the hundreds of thousands in very, very short time. And it's quite ironic that they call it the refugee crisis in Europe, because the crisis mainly is in neighboring countries. Pakistan had to deal with millions of refugees, and so did Syria around the Iraq war, and so does the countries around Syria now, and so do Yemenis who have to flee. What I want to say is that it is the crisis, if there's a crisis in all the displacement issue, first it's for people who have to leave everything they know. They have to leave their houses, a place where they probably never imagined living in their entire life, unprepared and with no contingency, with no plans. And then it's a crisis to hosting communities around the country who were never prepared. They haven't been able to accommodate their own people. I'm speaking in the north of Jordan and in Iraq and in Syria before the conflict, and in Lebanon now. Lebanon, for example, has at least 1.5 million refugees, when the entire population is 4 million. So every fourth person is a Syrian. The country already didn't have enough ways to deal with their own population issues. They don't have enough services, they have their own political turmoil and so on. And then, obviously, it is a crisis to countries who are hosting refugees from very, very far away. We found that the media failed to reflect what are the agonies of these displaced people, of the host community around them, and also why do they leave their countries. There's parts of it that quite one would think are very clear. Who would put their children in a boat where the chances of surviving are 50-50 if being where they're coming from was not more dangerous, where their chances were not less. But not only that, it's all the network that they're losing. The security that comes from the society and from people around them, especially in places that wasn't developed enough to be individualized. And by that I mean, when I moved from Syria to the UK, I realized that my need to communicate with people is far less. I can find everything on the internet. I don't need to call people to give me suggestions on things, and I can do almost everything on my own, which is quite developed. It's because of development of services. In small local places where are now under conflict, it's not like that at all. The community provides a lot of support, provides a lot of base for people. So what women groups are trying to do is to strengthen this when the state fails to provide a safe ground for its own people. Like the case in Syria, where the state is attacking its own people, like the case in Yemen, where the state completely failed to protect their people from attack by another country, like in Libya, and so on. These are some of the countries we work in, and it takes different shapes, but very similar consequences in other countries, where there's a military crackdown, like Egypt, where there was a political turmoil, like Tunisia. So what we found is that women groups are trying to create and strengthen this local support system to make survival possible, but also to change everything that war imposing. And some of the examples we found is like women groups, for example, in Syria, in one of the refugee camps in Ottoman, a displaced camp actually, so it's inside the Syrian borders. The use of arms increased significantly in the past few years because the state gave up its role of ensuring any rule of law. And women used one incident where there has been a disagreement where all men are armed, and they required that they've done a campaign inside the displacement camp, and they required that no arms are used in public places. And this is one of the very few ones that we could analyze. Actions done by women organically, they're not pushed by any ideological background, rather than their safety, their ability to monitor how their security and the security of their families would look like. And they said, we want to disarm. And that applies in the local settings, but it also applies in an international settings. And here I talk about peace agreements and how we have monitored and seen peace agreements happening. And you all must have heard about the movement, the feminist movements asking for women participation in peacemaking, in peacekeeping, and in negotiations. Part of it is quite straightforward. Any decision that's done without women would not be reflecting the needs of the entire society. Definitely true. But there's another depth to this, especially in peace agreements, where the current style of peace talks and peace agreements, unfortunately, is becoming the room where men with arms who control territory sit after they're tired of many years of conflict. It's not peace building, it's not negotiating a peace as much as it is an attempt to get those exhausted men to share the cake differently. And unfortunately, because women are very rarely armed, they very rarely control territory, we end up with them not on the table, because what it takes to be on that table is not your role in society, it's your role in making war. And we have seen so many peace negotiations around the world where women were completely missing. And there's a friend, an academic, a fantastic academic called Tanya Paffenholz, who sat and analyzed war peace processes in 40 different conflicts in the past 10 years. And she wasn't hoping to do a gender analysis. That wasn't one of the things she wanted to do when she started this study. But then she found out that conflict where women were involved were more likely to actually not fall apart. They were more likely to be, far more likely to be implemented, and they were definitely more focusing on the human security, on the security of individuals, on services. We saw it in those peace processes that are actually open and public. You see men discussing, and I'm not making a stereotype, I'm speaking about men who are basically warlords or have been actively involved in the conflict. And they sit and discuss, what do I get and what do you get, and how much arms can we make out of you, and what territory would I be controlling, and what positions would I get. And then when women come to the table, having not been part of the war, part of the action of war, they ask, when do we return to our country? When do the millions of refugees come back and those displaced go back to their houses? When do the schools open? When do the services are provided again? And what are we doing about reconstruction? That's not a suggestion that women don't have a stake in war. I'm sure many of you are thinking of examples where women held arms and took active role in hostilities, but that hasn't been a systematic case at all, especially in the countries we work in. What has been happening is that this war is imposed on them in every shape and form, and they're even denied a way of making things different. So back to some of the examples we have seen. They work a lot on the local level, but they also try through many partners around the world, through we call it the sisterhood, we call the support, the amazing support they get, for example, from WILF volunteers and members around the world who are happy to go to the streets and demonstrate for women in Yemen and women in Syria, and for women who don't have this luxury of having their voice heard. So one of the most recent things we've done, and we found great outcome, is we realized that Syria, for example, is the most documented conflict on earth. There's no conflict that has been documented that well. So you can now actually go to Amnesty website and have a 360 degrees view of Aleppo, the most dangerous place on earth. You can go there, you can see the destruction, you can walk through Aleppo. It's that sort of documentation that now we expect in a conflict country. When 40 years ago you barely have one or two photos from a conflict country. So it's very well documented. Unfortunately, the way it impacts women is completely missing. We have numbers of male victims and women victims, male survivors and women survivors, that sort of things. But the way it's impacting them is completely missing. So we worked with our partners, women groups working inside Syria and in neighboring countries, on sitting and developing our skills, all of us, to try and analyze how things impact women differently. And the outcome was amazing. It's all in their heads. They never thought of putting it on paper. First, because nobody cares. They've never been asked how things impact them differently. And second, because if the irony of lives being so cheap, the fact that people die in the hundreds and sometimes thousands on a daily basis and nobody look at it. So they feel it's undue attention if we ask, but how does that impact you differently? How does it impact you as from a gender perspective, but also from an individual perspective? Tell me, how did your life become more difficult? And we found that women find it very, very hard to say, I lost my right to movement, right to freedom of movement. My daughters are no longer getting education when they see people dying. They just feel that they don't have the luxury of discussing this. So when we sat and said, this is what we need to do, we need to analyze, you on behalf of all the communities you live in and work in, need to analyze how this impacts you differently. The outcome was fascinating. The two examples I gave to you about how the lack of movement, so the use of explosive weapons, doesn't allow them to get to hospitals. And I'll give you an example that we found in that workshop. OCHA, the UN Humanitarian Assistance Agency, has done publishes numbers about healthcare, about injuries, and so on. And one of the numbers was that cesarean operations have raised to sometimes 81% in communities where there's absolutely no healthcare. And their reading of it was that, oh, healthcare is fantastic. 81% of pregnant women are going and getting cesareans when the universal average is 17%. The woman who we sat with told us that this is actually the worst case of collapse of health system, because these women know that most probably if they wait until they're naturally due, until they deliver naturally, the chances are that they'll die in their houses without the chance to go to a hospital or to a health center. First, because all of them are destroyed due to air attacks, and second, because even if they were there, they might not reach to them because of the extensive use of explosive weapons. So they, any minute in their 8th month or 9th month where they have good enough chances of their fetus coming out alive, they go to any healthcare provider. That could be a doctor, a nurse, person who have been around a nurse long enough, anyone who can cut them open and get that baby out of them, because that makes the chances more likely of them and their babies surviving. So it's the women who we worked with who told us this very small fact that OCHA completely missed, that other organizations who you expect have the best professionals completely didn't notice. Same for, we realized that women are more likely to have malnutrition in siege. Besiegement is one of the techniques that are very extensively used in Syria, both by the Syrian regime and later on by some armed groups. And we realized that women are more likely to get malnourished. And the women who we work with told us that because women do all the searching for food, they're the ones who go and search for food. They're the ones who go and queue for hours and hours in front of any available aid because men are too proud to go and queue for food. They are the ones who do all the cooking, and they are the ones who eat absolutely least and definitely last. They feed their children, they make sure their husbands are fed, they make sure elderlies are fed, and then they eat, which very, very scarce resources anyway. So I won't take you through the entire report. We were only allowed to submit 10 pages to the Universal Periodic Review. So it only looks at one perpetrator, which is the Syrian government, and it only looks at 8 different issues. But I think the practice was very important. I think more importantly than the report, we have created and developed the urge to analyze how things impact women differently, how arms impact them differently, why do women get more harmed if individual men have small arms, and so on. So we find our duty to take this knowledge, these recommendations, what they want, and bring it internationally. That's the very small role that we have, but that they think is very important. We also try to bring these experiences into international policies around the response to conflict and also about aid. Last year there was the Humanitarian Summit, which was supposed to be the big summit that reconsiders how aid is being provided in conflict areas, but also in natural disaster in any case, and how they make that more humanitarian. And many organizations, including WILF and others, we lobbied together and provided evidence-based documents saying that there's no way aid will reach to those in most need if women groups, local women groups, were not completely involved in first putting aid strategies, second implementing aid strategies, and monitoring aid strategies. Unless we make sure that they are at the center of the aid process, it never goes to the right people. It never goes to a development role. It never goes to development goals. It could go to useless issues or even destructive issues like buying arms, like supporting groups against others and so on. So our partners do analysis and advocacy. Participation, we have seen how we tried. One of the things that we assessed by our partners in different countries is their need to find a space to communicate. There's a professor who told us that in Northern Ireland, when the women were trying to have a better role in the conflict and in the conflict resolution, it was very easy because they could just go to each other's houses and meet and discuss and chat. And we really realized how in places where there's a big displacement movement, that's not a possibility. Our Yemeni partners, for example, so in a matter of few weeks, they are in 14 different countries. Our 14 partners are everywhere because they were never allowed to go back to their country after the most recent attack. Same for our partners in Syria, who are everywhere. This space to communicate is no longer available, so we tried to create it. And we were lucky enough to see first how this communication is happening and how the exchange is happening, but also to give the chance to people in different stages of the conflict to support each other. So for example, 2 years ago we had a big meeting for women from Bosnia and Syria, and our Bosnian partners said that that has been extremely important to them because as they go through their experiences to convey it to their Syrian partners, they managed to revisit their experience of 20 years, of what they've done right, what they've done wrong, what did they want, and how do they analyze it 20 years later. And that group actually who worked together to do the 2014 conference still work together now. And that was very similar for our Syrian partners, who first found out that the awful position they're in is not unique. It has happened before. It could happen again. Now they are asking us to arrange a meeting for them and for Ukrainian women so they can tell them what to do and what not to do, what to try, what to give a chance. So last thing I want to say is that I think what we do and what you all can contribute to is to look at the displacement and migration movement beyond its very, very final manifestations, which actually people arriving to new countries and what to do about them then. It's about looking at people who don't want to take part in hostilities. They never chose to be in war. They never chose a conflict to be in their country. All they want is to live, to have minimum, to have their human rights, but also minimum conditions to continue their life. I think women groups in country do that. And I think they deserve all the support possible. And the way we can support them is in few ways. First one is to know. And this bit you all have done already, at least to attempt to know more about what is mainstream media not telling us. Sometimes when I watch mainstream media in this country, I think that migrants and refugees just fell from the sky. Nothing happened, and we woke up and found them all here. So we need to know what's not being told to us and what conditions people are fleeing and how a difference could be made about them. And we need to act. And we were discussing this morning how can that, unfortunately, the way politics are happening are making us feel that our individual voices could not make a difference, that we're not strong enough, or that there's so many influences and bigger powers that are deciding for us, and that's true. I still think we can make a difference. If not in the end actions, which we will collectively and on the long term, but changing the discourse about refugees and migrants, changing the discourse about people in entire societies. We were in the AWID forum last week, and we had a very heated conversation about religious fundamentalism. And there was some feminist views that unfortunately painted entire societies with one big wide brush, accusing groups, very large groups of people, to be the cause of this act or this terrorist act or this new fears that are posed to us. And I genuinely believe if the feminist movement did not stand strong and clearly against all sorts of discrimination, particularly discrimination that attack entire societies far, far away and get them to have to defend themselves. Like women groups we work with, where suddenly 100 organizations from around the world want them to combat violent extremism. And none of them identify what they do as combating violent extremism because they think it's what they do is the norm. So for example, what they do in education, in combating child recruitment, in providing healthcare and providing supporting civic peace, none of them would call that combating violent extremism. So we need to take their knowledge and their experiences into calling things what we want to call. It cannot be transferred that way, it has to be transferred the other way around. And they know exactly, if anything, violent extremism impact people in local societies 2 million times more than it impacts people far, far away. It's people in this society who have their own freedoms limited, their ability to move limited. Much of their life is being completely changed, and they know how to fight it, and we need to support them fight it the way they feel fighting it is going to happen. And the last thing we can do is inform. Changing the discourse is not only the mainstream media discourse, it's also our day-to-day discourse. And I know we're all put as individuals and as small groups in that corner where we feel it's too complicated, I'll just choose not to know about it tomorrow, and I'll sit tomorrow, not to know about it today, and I'll sit tomorrow and try to understand this conflict in Libya. And I think we can take a step back and just think about the very basic things that we do know. We do know that explosive weapons are being used extensively against civilians in both, at least Yemen and Syria, and that's no way it could be justified. So that's one thing we know. We also know that most of the people killed in both countries are civilians, and that's no way the solution to everything. We know that the people who are being attacked by extremely advanced arms do not have access to similar research or arms to defend themselves, and that could by no way be correct. So if we take such simple facts and decide to start from them, I think it helped me understand many conflicts, and I do think it does help. And we also have a duty to do the analysis when the people impacted are not here to do it. I ask people all the time, whenever they see anything on one of the countries we work with in the media, to ask themselves, what do civilians think about this? What do women think about this? Simply because Libyan women are not allowed a seat on any table here to say what they think. And it's our duty to bring what they would think. Just the question at least. When somebody suggests sending far more arms, or bombing more, or killing more, what do women think? If they're denied a seat, we need to fill their seat and say what they would have said. And it doesn't have to be an entire policy briefing and policy recommendations and a million things. Just very basic things that we know for a fact they would have said if they were allowed a place on any table we have a place on. I'll stop here. You're more than welcome to discuss any of the points we raised, as we do in the countries we work on. I just want to raise 2 points before I conclude. The first one is our Secretary General and a few peace laureates, Nobel Peace Prize laureates, last year went through the Balkan routes, and they walked with refugees all the way to Germany to see with their own eyes what is it like for refugees. And they have made a few statements. One of them is asking for safe passages for people. One of them is looking at the gendered impact of this move. And one of the observations that was quite horrific was that women fell out of jurisdiction in most European countries where the rule of law is actually good, when there are some sort of gendered laws. Like, for example, there are countries where there is very good law on sexual violence. However, it simply doesn't apply to refugees because they fell out of the legal system, and that's extremely, extremely harmful. Obviously, to the people who are subject to such violence, they were subject to this violence by the police but also the state shied away from individuals who are applying it to them. But it's extremely harmful to women from these countries when violence comes back to the streets and is back on the social scene, when they have walked a few steps beyond it over the past years. So that's something we need to look at. So safe passage and everyone's access to justice. The statements are available. I'm happy. Drop me an email, and I'm happy to send it to you. They're also in our Wealth website. And I'd love to hear more of your thoughts or any questions you have, any things you think we should be doing, and all your thoughts on